Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope y'all are doing well. Today we're going to design a URL shortener. This is what we're going to be eventually designing. We're going to break the problem down into two parts. One is going to be generating the short URL, and the other is going to be obtaining the long URL from the short URL. It's totally cool if a lot of it does not make much sense right now. We are going to go ahead and recreate both these diagrams from scratch, and we will be able to zoom in to look at all the text that you can't right now. Alright, so I'm going to move this to the left to begin with, and then let's start with talking about what is a URL shortener and how does it work exactly. So fundamentally, a URL shortener has two functions. One is to generate the short URL from long URLs, and the other one is being able to retrieve the long URL from the short URLs. To give you an end-to-end example, let's say you have a link, a long URL called zillow.com/home/Toronto, and then some other string, and you want to generate a short URL from this one. So the system should be able to give you a very short URL with some kind of ID at the end that's going to help the system recognize what is the long URL for this one. Later on, let's say you have the short URL and you want to be able to go back to the long URL. The system should be able to find this long URL and then redirect the user, which is you, to the long URL, which in this case is the zillow.com link over here. So let's talk a bit about how can we generate the short URL from these long URLs before we go into the diagram to recreate the whole thing. So to generate the short URL, which is going to be this one, from a long URL, you can use any deterministic hashing function. What you want is the hashing function to generate the same output for the same input. So you want it to be deterministic because every time you get a long URL, you want to make sure that this long URL always maps to the same short URL. So an easy way, of course, is you take the hash and you put the hash over here. But the problem with that is these hashes tend to be very long, up to like 256 characters. So of course you don't want to give the whole hash over here, because if you do that, essentially your short URL is going to be longer than the long URL that you're given. So instead of taking the whole hash value, you can take the first 4 to 5 characters or the last 4 to 5 characters and then append it over here. Now the problem with that is you don't know if that's going to be unique or not, because you're not taking the full hash, which most probably is going to be unique, but you're taking the first 4 to 5 characters. So to make sure that it's a unique value, what you can do is before storing this mapping from long to short URL in the database, you can check that if this combination of characters, so these 4 to 5 characters, does it already exist in your database? If it does, that means there is a collision. In that case, what you can do is go ahead and append some predetermined string to the end of the long URL, and then recompute the hash, take the first 4 or 5 characters, check if it's there in the database. You can keep doing this until you find the 4 to 5 characters that does not have any conflict. Most probably you will increase the 4 to 5 characters depending on the use case of your application. If you expect this to be a very high volume, then instead of having 4 to 5 characters, you can have like 8 to 9 or something. But essentially that's how we're going to make sure that it's very easy to generate these URLs, and at the same time we're not running into any collisions. When it comes to storing these mappings in the database, we are going to have a very simple relational table. In our case, it's going to be 3 columns, an ID, long URL, and short URL. The ID is going to be just an auto-incrementing ID. Long URL is going to be the long URL, and then the short URL is going to be the short URL with the generated hash string. Okay, so let's go ahead and build that up first before we can talk about any performance improvement. Okay, so we are gonna draw everything from scratch over here. So the first thing is, of course, gonna be our web browser. This is gonna be the client that actually calls our backend. I'm gonna increase the font size. There you go. So the client is gonna hit the load balancer at first. Now the first question is, how does the client pass the long URL to the load balancer? So to make sure that you have something to reference, this is gonna be generating the short URL. Okay. All right. So now the first question is, how does the web browser pass the long URL to the load balancer? So that's gonna be very simple. We are gonna have a HTTP post request to an endpoint. Let's call it the short link endpoint. And within the post request, of course, you want to have a request body, and that request body will contain, let's just do contains the long URL. I'm gonna decrease the font size. There you go. All right, so your browser calls the load balancer with the HTTP post request to the short link endpoint. And this request in the body is going to contain the long URL that you need the short URL for. Okay. All right, now what the load balancer does is goes ahead and calls our API. So I'm going to put this huge block over here. And then we're going to give it a sticker and call it API server. Okay, so this whole thing is going to be all the logic and technology in our API server. What the load balancer does is we are going to have multiple copies of our API running in multiple machines. That's what you call horizontal scaling. And it's the load balancer's job to figure out amongst the 5-6 API servers which one to actually hit. This makes sure that all the user requests are not ending up in the same API server. All right, so once we are in the API server, the first thing we're gonna do, okay. So the first thing the API does is extract the long URL from the request body. No matter which API, the backend framework you're using, this should be very straightforward. You can just use a function to extract the long URL from the request. Okay, so at this point you have the long URL with you. Now your job is to to generate the short URL for this long URL. But the first thing you want to do before generating it is actually go ahead and check. Okay, you want to check if the mapping already exists. Okay, so if you remember, our table has long URL to short URL. You want to be sure that this is not a long URL that you have seen before, because otherwise you're gonna be generating this short URL for nothing, right? So you check the mapping to see if it already exists, and this is our MySQL table. Okay. If the mapping already exists, you don't need to generate a new short URL. You go ahead and give the user the short URL. So you just give them the HTTPS, let's call it tinyurl.com, and let's say our hash was that one. Okay, so all you're doing is getting the short URL from the database and passing it back to the browser. Now, let's say you don't have the short URL for that long URL, right? So this is the first time you're seeing this long URL. Okay, so then the first thing you do is gonna be over here. I'll zoom in. There you go. So you generate the 5 to 6 characters hash for long URL. So you pass the long URL into a function that goes ahead and generates that hash. Now, if you remember, we want to make sure that the hash we just generated is not a duplicate. So you talk to your database for that. Let me just make sure this works. Okay. And this is going to be double-sided. Okay. So at first, of course, you generate the hash. Oh, let me just make sure we can have some text over here. Okay, there we go. All right, just bear with me. I'm gonna just, okay. So let me just write it down and then we can talk about it. All right, let's position it horizontally and then let's decrease the font size. Perfect. So once we generate the 5 to 6 characters hash for the from the long URL. So let's just continue 5 to 6 hash for short URL, let's call it. Okay. So once we generate the hash, we want to make sure that this is not a hash that already exists in our table. So we generate it, we check in our MySQL table to see if the data is already there. If it's already there, we go back and generate it again by adding a prefix or suffix to our long URL. This is going to make sure that we have no collision in our system. Once we find a hash that is actually unique, we go ahead and write it to the MySQL table. And at this point, you're going to have your long URL mapped to a short URL for future use. And once you go ahead and insert it, you can go ahead and return the new short URL back to your client. Now, this is going to be working a very straightforward version of a mapping between a long URL and a short URL. But let's see how we can improve the performance of it, right? So the first thing you can consider is that from a functionality point of view, it's very likely that whenever a user creates a new short link for a long URL, they are very likely to access that very soon. Because of that, what you can do is prematurely prepare a cache, which is going to have all your recent mappings of long URL to short URL. This way, whenever the user requests for a short URL that they just created, you're going to be able to serve that directly from the cache instead of calling your database every single time. Okay. In our case, we're going to use a Redis cache, but it can be literally a memcache or anything that you want. So once we make sure that the data has been written into the MySQL table, we go ahead and insert the same data into the cache with some TTL. What does it mean by some TTL? So let's take that into cache with TTL. What does it mean with the TTL? That means, let's say we put the data in there and tell Redis that keep this mapping in cache for the next 1 hour or 2 hours. If the user did not really access it in the first 1 to 2 hours, odds are they're going to access it later on. And at that point, we can just call the database for that. In terms of the data in the Redis cache, it totally depends. You can map it from long URL to short URL or vice versa, or you can have a mapping both ways. This way you can go from one to another very quickly. Totally depends on the caching technology you're using, but essentially we want to have these mappings accessible from the cache. So we are gonna go ahead and duplicate it. Let's change the color so that we know this is a cache. And then this is gonna be our Redis cache. All we're gonna do is go ahead and insert it over here. There you go. Oops, let's just make sure this is straight. There you go. Perfect. And then this can be none. Perfect. Okay. So that is going to be our working version of generating the short URL. This should be performant enough. So when the user wants to generate a short URL, they make a HTTP post request with the long URL in the request body. The load balancer figures out which API machine to hit. Once it hits the API server, the API server, we extract the long URL from the request body. We check to see if this long URL is already there in our database. If it is, then we go ahead and just return it to the client. If it's not there, then we go ahead and generate a hash that's going to be appended to the end of the short URL. So essentially this hello world bit over here. We make sure that the hash that we want to store is unique. If it is unique, then we go ahead and store it in the MySQL table, as well as the Redis cache, and then pass the short URL back to the user. In the case where there is a conflict, we generate a hash again by appending a prefix or suffix to the long URL and generating a hash again, taking the first 5 to 6 characters and then storing it in the MySQL table. Every time we store it in the MySQL table, we also put it in the Redis cache so that the updated entry is there ready to be served. All right, so that should be generating the URL. The next bit is gonna be retrieving the long URL from the short URL. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, we're gonna move, let me just copy paste a few things. Let's just have you guys move over here. Okay. Now we're gonna do obtaining the long URL from the short URL. So once again, the first thing is gonna be the browser. Okay. The next thing is gonna be the load balancer. I'm gonna zoom in. This is gonna be the load balancer. And then of course we are gonna have our server. Let's just have this whole thing as our server. Give it a color of white. Okay. And then let's give it the sticker, which is gonna make sure you know this is the API server. All right, that's pretty much all we need. Now let's talk about obtaining this long URL. Okay. So the first thing is, again, how is the web browser sending the request to the load balancer? This time it's gonna be even simpler. It's gonna be a GET request to our, let's call it tinyurl.com/hello world. Okay, so this is gonna be a very simple GET request to our tinyurl, which is gonna be our host with the appended hash at the end. All right, so the load balancer is gonna forward the request to the API server. The first thing that that's not what I want. There you go. The first thing the API server needs to do is gonna be extract hash from path. So hello world, right? So in our case, the tinyurl.com, this is static. All we care about is the last bit over here called hello world. It's going to be dynamic depending on the short URL, but that's what we want to extract at first. Okay. Once we extract that, of course, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and check our Redis. No, that's not what I want. Give me 1 second. Yeah. So this is going to be our Redis cache, which is going to be over here. So after extracting, we are going to check if mapping exists in cache. Because if the mapping is already there in cache, we don't really need to talk to the database. All we do is get the long URL and redirect the user to long URL. We're going to talk a bit more about the redirection and how it works, but right now let's just use it as a black box. In the case that the data is not there in Redis, we will need to talk to our MySQL database. So that's going to be over here. Actually, from here. No, do this. There you go. We want the arrow to go at the top, if it ever listens to me. Perfect. Okay. So there you go. That's gonna be our relational database. Let's say MySQL. Okay. So we do a very simple select star from, let's just reduce the font. Okay. We just do a select star from table where ShortURL equals this. Okay. It's going to be a very simple query, so it should be pretty performant. Once we get the long URL from the database, we just go ahead and return it to the client. Okay. All we do is redirect to long URL. All right, so that's going to be obtaining the long URL. So essentially what we're doing is the web browser is making a HTTP GET call to with the short URL to our load balancer. The load balancer figures out which API server to hit. Within the API server, we extract the last hash from the URL. We check if we already have the long URL for that in our Redis cache. If we do, we redirect to that long URL. If we don't, then we go ahead and look at our MySQL table for that long URL. Once we get it, we return it to the web browser. All right, so now, yes, right. So we have just a summary of it. So we check cache and then we read from database. The next thing is going to be to talk about the HTTP response, because right now we are just treating it as a redirect, but what does that really mean? So there can be two kinds of redirection from your server. One can be a 301 redirect and another is a 302 redirect. A 301 redirect is called a permanent redirect. This means that the browser is going to cache the response within itself. So the next time around, when the browser, or more likely the user, wants to go to a particular short URL, the browser will already know the long URL and directly take the user to the long URL rather than calling the server and then the server needing to do the redirect. The benefit of this is that your server for every short URL will get hit at most once, because the browser of that user will already know the long URL. But the problem is, given that your server will not be hit every time a user accesses the URL, you won't really know how many times the user is going somewhere, so you won't be able to track the activity. For a 302 redirect, it's a temporary redirect. That means that, let's say the user tells the browser to call the server gives back the long URL, and now the browser won't store that mapping in the browser cache, right? That means the next time around, when the user wants to go to the short URL, it's gonna hit your backend server yet again, and then the backend is what's gonna redirect the user to the long URL. Of course, the downside of this is that your server will be hit every single time someone needs to go to your short URL. But on the bright side, this means that you are going to be aware of every time the user utilizes your short URL. So if you want to have some kind of tracking or want to make sure that your product is being used as much as you want it to be used, you will be able to track all these. But of course, on the downside, your server will need to take more requests to make this functionality work. So with the little talk about redirection, that kind of wraps up everything that I wanted to go through. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick summary of the whole process. The first bit is going to be generating the short URL from the long URL. For that, the user is gonna call our API with the post request. In the request body, we're gonna have the long URL. In our backend server, we're gonna extract the long URL from the request body. We're gonna check the MySQL table to see if for this long URL, we already have a short one or not. If we do, we just return that back to the user. If we don't, then we go ahead, feed the long URL into a function that's gonna generate a hash and then take the first or last 5 to 6 characters. We're gonna talk to our MySQL table to make sure this is unique. If it's not unique, we're gonna generate it again by appending a prefix or suffix to the URL. Once we make sure that this hash is unique, we are gonna go ahead and store it in the MySQL table. And then the moment we write it to the MySQL table, we're also gonna persist that mapping in our Redis cache with the assumption that a user is more likely to access short URLs that were generated more recently. And then finally, we're gonna pass the short URL back to the user in their web browser. Then the next bit is gonna be obtaining the long URL from the short URL. Let's say a user has a short URL and they wanna actually go to the long URL that this short URL represents. The browser is going to hit our backend with a very simple GET request, which is going to be the tinyURL host. Within our API, we of course extract the hash from the path. So in this case, we're talking about the end bit because this is the only bit that's dynamic. We check our cache to see if the mapping already exists, because if you remember, when generating the mapping, we persist the mapping in our cache for like a few hours. If it's already there, then we just redirect the user back to that. If it's not there in the cache, we make a query to our MySQL table, which is a simple select query, giving it the short URL. Once we have the long URL, we just redirect the user back to the long URL. And going back to what we talked about, the redirection, there can be two kinds of redirection we give the user. One is a permanent redirect called 301, and one is a temporary redirect called a 302. Depending on your use case and what trade-offs you want to make, you can either use 301 or 302. Both has their pros and cons. So with that being said, I think that covers most of the intricacies around shortener, URL shortener. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. The next system we're going to design is going to be a notification system. Expect that video to come out in the next 2 to 3 days. That is going to be much more detailed because, as I mentioned before, the first two were supposed to be the easier ones where we talk about things on a more higher level. So now that we have done that, the notification system is going to be a bit more elaborate and it's going to cover some more intricate system design issues we're going to talk about. So hopefully you're going to watch that one too. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. With that being said, I hope you guys have a good rest of the day and I'm going to catch you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.